Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Cushman, who is the Robert C. Taylor Professor of English at the University of Virginia and the recent author of Belligerent Muse, Five Northern Writers and How They Shaped Our Understanding of the Civil War, which is now out with the University of North Carolina Press. So, Dr. Cushman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate your having me.
Now, we've got five different writers here that we're going to tackle, and we're going to give each one of them their fair shake, I think. But I was wondering if you could perhaps just start us off by what drew you to this topic originally.
Sure. I'm sort of an outlier in many ways in that I specialize in American literature, so I came at it from that angle. But I've also had a lifetime interest in the military history of the Civil War. And what I started to notice as I read and taught some of these things is that people often would read the works and love the writing, but not know much about the military history. Or people would know a lot about the military history and read the works as though they were self-evident, transparent windows on documentary fact. When from my point of view, every single one of them was also a kind of aesthetic creation. So I got interested in this hybrid approach of, on the one hand, being very interested in military history, but also being very interested in the ways that people write about it and the qualities of the writing itself. And I just started off, I think the first chapter that I worked on was the one on Walt Whitman, and the others sort of fell in line as the years went by. And then at the end, I began to say, well, yes, there really is a kind of argument here.
Now, we start with Abraham Lincoln. And I think for a lot of, Civil War readership out there, they think, oh, goody, more on Lincoln. You probably come down in one of two camps. You either come down in the genuine, oh, goody, more Lincoln, because I can't get enough of it, or a slight eye roll and a sigh and thinking not more on Lincoln.
Right.
But you're coming at this from a slightly different angle, and I think
Yes,
that's very
yes,
important for the readership to understand. So you take us through an interaction here with Emerson, as well as kind of bringing us back to two pieces that everyone probably be familiar with in the sense of the Gettysburg Address and the Second Inaugural. But you provide us, as you say, this hybrid. You're bringing in a couple different elements here. So why don't you take it away then and try and explain a little bit of what you're tackling with this chapter dealing with Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah, great. No, I sympathize with the eyeball rollers and the tens of thousands of books about Lincoln. Why could somebody possibly have the arrogance to think that he could add anything new to this? The meeting with Emerson, which happens in February of 1862 at the White House, has been noted by many people, but it hasn't ever been really closely studied. And so I think I am offering something new there that hasn't been done before. What you find out is that there's a kind of insoluble knot at the center of the meeting. When the two men meet, Lincoln is very quick to say to Emerson, "Oh, Mr. Emerson, I once heard you lecture, and you said that a person from Kentucky is likely to proclaim, 'I'm from Kentucky, and if you don't like it, so much the worse for you.'" What people who have thought about this moment have tended to assume is that Lincoln heard Emerson in Springfield when Emerson was there in 1851. But in fact, the things that Emerson said in Springfield in 1851 don't include that comment about the person from Kentucky at all. So there was a lot of detective work for me in trying to figure out when this happened. So I hope that's a new contribution, and I think it makes a difference because it shows us yet again something about Lincoln's mind and what Lincoln is thinking about at a particularly acute moment, 1862, leading up to Antietam, Sharpsburg, and then the Emancipation Proclamation. The two addresses, Gettysburg and the Second Inaugural, there have been some wonderful books on those, but again, I think there are always more things to say. I'll just give you a quick example. In the second inaugural, there's that great moment where Lincoln says, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away." And people have noticed, oh, that rhymes. Well, yes, it does, but no one's ever pointed out that what it really is a hymn stanza, a stanza in the meter of a good Protestant Presbyterian hymn that Lincoln might have heard. Small moment, but again, interesting to think about Lincoln as an artist, as really a kind of verbal musician, orchestrating these very memorable documents, these moments, these speeches. So there's a couple of I hope pleas for sympathy as I write about Lincoln.
Absolutely. And then we shift gears and we move towards Walt Whitman. And I think it's a really fascinating chapter, and apparently it's the one that you tackled first. But you make a pretty bold claim in here, right? In discussing Whitman's writing and how it defined how other people wrote about the war itself, and then how subsequent people have now written about Civil War memory. And obviously that is a very hot topic still today.
Yeah.
We've had numerous authors on here, Carrie Janey and others, who deal with Civil War memory. But it's a pretty fascinating take. So again, I want you to rise up here and testify as to the importance of Whitman as and his contributions.
Sure. I want to be very clear that I'm not making the claim that people who began writing about the war the way Whitman started to write about the war all necessarily had read Whitman and were doing it because they had read Whitman. I'm just trying to point out that he did it first. Yeah. And what I'm saying is that a couple of conventions that we now take for granted in Civil War writing, in a lot of historical writing, you see appearing very early in Whitman, as early as 1863, when he's writing for the New York Times. One of those conventions is the convention of personal presence, the convention of I, a person dramatizing himself or herself as a narrator. We love personal things. We don't want to read history that doesn't have a lot of personal stuff in it. But that has not always been the case, as you well know. I mean, a lot of the early stuff avoided personal touches like the plague. Another thing that happens with Whitman is his assumption that the best way to narrate the war is that one should narrate not from generals down, but from regular people up. Again, now we take that for granted. If you're going to write about Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iran or anything, we want stories of the people who are not in the headlines, people who are making this stuff work. But that, again, has not always been the case. Classical definitions of history, classical models of history, all are about generals. So there was a moment when this changed, and I think it is during the Civil War, and I think Whitman was out there first. And the last thing that I think that Whitman showed us a precedent for is taking an individual person, a soldier, a nurse, a civilian, whoever, David Thompson, right? Saying, here's this individual person, but I'm not going to just tell you his story. I'm going to tell you his story and then make the claim that his story is representative of lots and lots and lots of stories. And we do that now, again, as a matter of course. This is how professional history works. I go to an archive, I read about somebody, and I make the claim, this is really important. This stands for a lot more than just this person. Now we take it for granted it seems obvious, but it wasn't always obvious. And Whitman, again, I say, was there first.
And then we move into the largest chapter of the book, and you hint almost as the central chapter, a pivot point, if you will. And we discuss William Tecumseh Sherman. And yeah. I think for a lot of people who love the Civil War and love studying the Civil War, they're obviously very familiar with Sherman. Here we are, the 150th anniversary of his march to the sea. People have quoted Sherman before. War is hell, is something that people throw out there early and often. But Sherman the writer, I think, is something that people don't really think that much about. They think a lot about Grant, obviously, with his memoirs, but obviously Sherman wrote his own. And so I wondered if you could discuss a little bit of Sherman the writer and what do we glean from the memoirs of General William T. Sherman?
Sure. This is the one that I hope is a real contribution to the field, because no one really has talked about this, with the exception of Edmund Wilson very briefly in Patriotic Gore. Everybody talks about Grant. The Library of America publishes the two memoirs, Grant's and Sherman's. If you look on Amazon.com, Grant sells many more copies, and people talk about him all the time. I teach Grant in our Civil War course that we have coming up in the spring here. But what's interesting is that Grant wrote his memoirs only because he needed to financially, with the encouragement of Mark Twain. If he hadn't been swindled in a bad business deal, there is no evidence that Grant ever would have written his memoirs. He steadfastly avoided requests, pressures to publish up to that point, and it seems that he would have continued to do so. Sherman is exactly the opposite. There is evidence very early on at West Point, when he's there, that Sherman wants to be an artist. He starts out, he wants to be a painter. And so there's a lot about painting in his letters, and just a little bit in the memoirs, not much. But he doesn't do that. He goes into the Army instead. And Lloyd Lewis, one of Sherman's early biographers, great biographer in my opinion, says that, well, what happened was Sherman, the thwarted painter, discovered his true art in the art of war. Which is an interesting argument, but I think is a little odd that you could turn from wanting to paint pictures and faces to destroying buildings and bridges and people and say that somehow that's equivalent. My argument is, yeah, Sherman was an artist and had an artistic temperament. He loved the theater. He loved reading. He reread Dickens's Great Expectations the day he died. He's a very deeply literate man and literary man. But he didn't become a painter. Instead, he became a writer. Oh, yes, in between, he was also General Sherman. But what we find when we look at the memoirs is this is a very carefully managed work of art. And you can look at it in many, many ways. Allusions to Shakespeare. You can look at the manuscripts, as I did in the Library of Congress, see how he's adjusted things, see the revisions he's made. He's clearly working very hard on this book. Later in life, he also corresponded with Twain, became a friend of Mark Twain. So he's thinking this way. The reason this matters, I think, is that Sherman discovered, really, as you say, where we are right now, 150 years later, in 1864 and also in 1865, that the way he was perceived by his enemies, in this case, the way he was perceived was potentially an instrument of war that he could use, that he could wield, that he could manipulate. And so he put a great deal of emphasis on managing how he was perceived. It didn't always work, as in 1862 when he's accused of being insane for wanting 200,000 soldiers in Kentucky, or when Stanton censures him brutally for offering Joe Johnston terms that were too generous in North Carolina in April of 1865. But except for moments like that, you can see Sherman working very hard all the time to make his name good and make his image powerful. And you can see it in the writing, and you can see it in the soldier. And what I try to argue in the chapter is there's a continuity there, and we ought to pay attention to it.
And then we move on to Ambrose Bierce. And I'm sure that everyone has read probably something of his, if they are not even necessarily someone who's interested in the Civil War, but a lot of us, I remember reading I believe it was an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge.
Yeah.
At some point, perhaps junior high, early high school, or something. So I think we've all, whether you realize it or not, have read something by Bierce at some point. But you draw on the Battle of Chickamauga here, and with your discussion of Bierce, and what did you find?
Well, what's interesting is, yeah, I mean, many people know Bierce through either Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, or the other one that people love is the Devil's Dictionary and all his wonderful, eccentric, mean sayings and quotations. But he was also a very capable topographic engineer in serving under General Hazen. And he is at Chickamauga on September 19th and 20th, 1863. And what I did was take the written record of not only what he says about Chickamauga, he wrote about Chickamauga many times in different modes, including a short story called Chickamauga, but also newspaper, other kinds of nonfiction accounts. Taking those accounts, taking correspondence that Bierce had, unpublished correspondence that Bierce had with Archibald Gracie, who wrote a book called The Truth About Chickamauga in published in 1911, and beginning to realize that Bierce isn't always right about things, that in fact he makes some mistakes about the record. We don't ever see these mistakes because he's so aggressive in his persona and his scornfulness, the tone he adopts, that people are often on the defensive when they think about Bierce. He seems to be so sure of himself. But in fact, some of Bierce's scholars and biographers have pointed out that Bierce never went to college, and he may have nursed a kind of inferiority complex with respect to West Pointers. He was, after all, only a lieutenant, but he seemed to speak in his stories. He seems to speak in his stories and his writings about Chickamauga as though he had much more authority than that. Well, what I began to realize is he developed that authority, or the sound of that authority, the tone of that authority, by reading the accounts of generals. And particularly, he was interested in Daniel Hill's account of Chickamauga. And you can see, if you read Hill's account of Chickamauga and Bierce's accounts, and you put them side by side, you realize Bierce says he has read Hill. He says in correspondence that he's read Hill. You can see and hear that Bierce is directly trying to imitate Hill and Hill's general tone, his general's tone, his professional officer's tone, his West Pointer's tone, and that this is something Bierce deliberately cultivates. It's not something that he earned as a lieutenant. It's not something that he came by in his education, because he didn't have extensive education, but it is something that he develops, and quite deliberately. And so that's the point of that chapter, is that Bierce is something that's happened to Bierce at Chickamauga. You can tell he's been through a major experience of some sort, and he's trying to figure out how to write about it. And he tries to write about it in many different ways. And the ways he writes about it show him experimenting with different voices and different tones that end up producing the guy we know.
And finally, we end with Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And obviously a name, if people are familiar with the Eastern Theater, if they've seen the movie Gettysburg or Red Killer Angels, he's obviously a very prominent character in that. But today we're talking about his role in terms of surrender at Appomattox, which, as a Maine native, you hear all about Chamberlain's honorable salute to General John B. Gordon as the Confederates are surrendering at Appomattox in April of 1865. But there is an evolution to this narrative, and it's something that you trace, and trace quite effectively, I might add. So I wonder if you could just give us a glimpse into this story and how it evolves over time.
Sure. I remember going to Appomattox the first time, and the ranger reciting the narrative of Gordon surrendering to Sherman, to Chamberlain, and Chamberlain's soldiers coming to present arms. And I got tears in my eyes, and the people around me got tears in their eyes. And I just thought this was an extraordinary moment that we should all be thinking about all the time. Well, what I now know is the Ranger was repeating Chamberlain's version. And Chamberlain's version is the one that has ruled memory of the surrender at Appomattox. What you find out when you start digging is that there are 6 primary versions of it. There's one that he writes to his sister the day after the surrender, April 13th, 1865. That's at Bowdoin in the special collections. Then there's one 1868. There's one 1894. There's one 1901, 1903, and then the last one is in his Passing of the Armies, 1915, which comes out the year after he dies. What happens is there are slight variations in details. That's very true. He doesn't always put the same units in the same places. But as you go through, what happens is the story of the surrender and the gesture of the salute that Chamberlain's men offer to Gordon's men becomes burnished, becomes a little more lustrous as you go through. I disagree with people who say that he falsified. I don't think the evidence points that way. But he was, again, a writer. He went on. He taught rhetoric at Bowdoin. He became governor of the state. He was president of Bowdoin. He became governor of the state of Maine. This is clearly a very verbal guy who knows how to use words to produce certain effects, and he does this. And the point of that chapter is he did such a good job. In the 1890s, for example, Chamberlain and Gordon used to appear on stages together, and they would talk about the surrender and so forth. Chamberlain did such a good job in his narratives, in the way they evolved, that today, people who don't know much about the Civil War, and I don't say that scornfully or condescendingly, but it's just not what they do, they still know the story. They still know about the surrender, and at the end of that chapter, I look at various instances. You can find references to the surrender in books on interpersonal relations and how to forgive one another. You can find references to the surrender in books about business leadership and strategic planning. You can find references to Chamberlain's account of the surrender in books for ministers on pastoral theology. In other words, his story has generated huge effect, and that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the evolution of it, yes, but I'm particularly interested in how it lives on for us now and how effective Chamberlain's various versions have become.
A man who excelled at self-promotion, I think,
yes, yeah.
Is probably putting it mildly. Well, Dr. Cushman, I appreciate you taking some time to speak with us today. Again, everyone, the book is Belligerent Muse. I just want to make sure I get the subtitle right here. 5 Northern Writers and How They Shaped Our Understanding of the Civil War, published by UNC Press. It's beautifully written, I think, first of all, is something that needs to be emphasized. It's a joy to read. And I think the icing on the cake for anybody who might be a skeptic out there, I'm not saying that they are out there, but because he's an English professor, I know you might think it's a bit wordy and stuff. It has the glowing endorsement of Dr. Cushman's colleague, Gary Gallagher, at the University of Virginia, who in the foreword here pretty much says that a lot of English stuff can be tough to read at times, but this is absolutely fantastic. So I have to agree with Dr. Gallagher on this one, and can't recommend it enough. So do pick it up. It's going to give you wonderful insight, again, into not only the writing of these individuals and how that it impacts others, but again, that context, that military, the situation of what's occurring and how that's impacting or not impacting how these individuals write about certain events. It's really something to think about. So, Dr. Cushman, thanks again for taking some time, and hopefully we can have you on again in the future to talk about a future project.
Thanks very much, David. I really appreciate it.